The fluorescent lights of St. Margaret's Hospital buzzed with an electrical hum that seemed to amplify the tension in the sterile corridor. Madison Hayes stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, her pale blue hospital gown hanging loosely over her 7-month pregnant frame, the thin fabric offering no protection against what was about to unfold. Her honey blonde hair, usually styled to perfection for the charity galas and society events she'd once graced, now hung limp around her shoulders, still damp from the cold sweat of morning sickness that had brought her here for an emergency checkup. Through the automatic doors at the end of the corridor came the unmistakable click of Italian leather shoes, a sound Madison had once associated with coming home, with safety, with love. Now it sent ice through her veins. Benjamin Cross emerged from the elevator like a storm front, moving in, his 6'3" frame cutting through the hospital's afternoon bustle, with the confidence of a man who believed the world existed solely to accommodate his desires. His charcoal Armani suit, the one she'd helped him pick for their anniversary just months ago, remained immaculate despite the humid September heat outside. But it wasn't Benjamin who made Madison's knees threaten to buckle. It was the woman whose perfectly manicured hand rested possessively on his arm, Victoria Sterling, with her raven black hair cascading like silk over her shoulders, wearing a crimson dress that seemed deliberately chosen to mock the sanctity of a hospital, a place of healing transformed into a stage for cruelty. Madison, Benjamin's voice, sliced through the ambient hospital sounds, the distant beeping of monitors, the squeak of gurneys, the hushed conversations of nurses. His tone carried not a hint of warmth, only the irritation of a CEO forced to deal with an unpleasant quarterly report. "We need to settle this. I've had the papers drawn up. Sign them, and we can all move on with our lives." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around them, the hospital's rhythm stuttered. A young nurse pushing a medication cart slowed her pace. 2 residents at the nurse's station turned to watch, their coffee forgotten. An elderly man in a wheelchair, being pushed by his grandson, stopped to witness what was unfolding. "Papers?" Madison's voice emerged as barely a whisper, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly where their child grew. "Ben, I'm carrying our baby. Your child." Victoria's laugh tinkled through the corridor like breaking crystal, sharp and deliberately cruel. "Oh, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she examined her perfect French manicure. "Benjamin and I have plans that don't include complications. Besides, in your current state, who's to say whose child it really is? Desperation makes people do terrible things." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Madison felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. She pressed her palm against the cool hospital wall to steady herself, the paint rough under her trembling fingers. This couldn't be real. She had come here worried about decreased fetal movement, scared for her baby's health. She hadn't expected her entire world to shatter in a sterile hallway that smelled of disinfectant and broken promises. "How dare you?" Madison managed, her voice gaining strength even as tears threatened to spill. "How dare you stand there, wearing the necklace I know he bought with our money, and question my integrity? I have been nothing but faithful, nothing but devoted." "Devoted?" Benjamin scoffed, his jaw clenching in that way she'd once found attractive but now recognized as a warning sign of his cruelty. "Is that what you call your pathetic neediness? Your constant emotional demands? I'm building an empire, Madison. I don't have time for your hormonal hysteria." "I loved you," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them, hanging between them like evidence at a crime scene. "I actually loved you, Benjamin." "Love," he repeated, the word twisting in his mouth like something rotten. "Love doesn't close deals, Madison. Love doesn't build portfolios or secure mergers. Your father's connections did that. But now I have Victoria's family's European holdings. I don't need Douglas Hayes's regional influence anymore." The revelation hit Madison with crushing clarity. Every tender moment, every whispered promise in the dark, every time he placed his hand on her growing belly with what she'd thought was wonder, all of it had been a calculated performance. A business strategy dressed up as romance. "You never loved me," she said. Not a question, but a recognition of truth. "I was just a stepping stone." "You were an investment," Benjamin corrected coldly. "One that's no longer yielding returns." Something inside Madison snapped. It wasn't violent or dramatic, it was quiet, like the moment when metal that has been bent too many times finally gives way. Her body moved before her mind could process the decision. Her hand arced through the air, with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The slap connected with Benjamin's face with a sound that echoed through the corridor like thunder. The force of it turned his head to the side, leaving a perfect red handprint blooming across his cheek like a brand of shame. The hospital fell silent. Even the mechanical sounds seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Benjamin's hand moved to his face in shock, his eyes wide with disbelief. In all their years together, through all his dismissals and degradations, Madison, had never raised a hand to him. She had been the perfect wife, accommodating, understanding, eternally patient with his growing coldness and increasing absences. "You little," he started, his face contorting with rage. "You're right about one thing, Benjamin," Madison interrupted, her voice carrying through the corridor with unexpected authority. "This is over. But not on your terms. Never again on your terms." Behind them, the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking rang out. Benjamin's head snapped toward the sound. A teenage volunteer in a candy striper uniform stood frozen, phone still raised, having captured the entire confrontation. Within seconds, the video would be uploading, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The moment that would destroy Benjamin Cross had been caught in full HD clarity. "Delete that," Benjamin commanded, striding toward the terrified volunteer. "Delete it now, or I'll sue you into oblivion." But the girl, no more than 17 with wide brown eyes and trembling hands, had already hit post. The damage was done. What Benjamin didn't know, what he couldn't know in his arrogance, was that this teenager was Melissa Chen, daughter of investigative journalist Patricia Chen, who had been tracking Benjamin's corporate malfeasance for months. The video would be on her mother's desk within minutes, accompanied by a full investigation that had been waiting for exactly this moment to break. Victoria, for her part, tried to salvage the situation with her usual manipulation. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing to Benjamin's side with exaggerated concern. "Did everyone see that? This pregnant woman just assaulted my fiancé completely unprovoked. Someone call security." But the witnesses in the hallway weren't buying her performance. The nurse with the medication cart shook her head in disgust. The residents exchanged knowing looks. The elderly man in the wheelchair spoke up with a voice that carried the authority of decades. "I saw everything, young lady. That man got exactly what he deserved." A security guard rounded the corner, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the scene with the weary expression of someone who had seen enough domestic disputes to recognize the truth when he saw it. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Madison with unexpected gentleness, "are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Madison almost laughed at the irony. She was in a hospital, surrounded by medical professionals, but no one could heal the kind of wounds she was carrying. "I'm fine," she said, though her legs were shaking now, adrenaline making her feel both powerful and fragile. "I just need to sit down." "There's a family waiting room just down the hall," the guard said, shooting Benjamin a warning look that made it clear any further aggression would not be tolerated. "I'll escort you there." As Madison turned to leave, supported by the unexpected kindness of a stranger, she heard Benjamin's voice one more time, low and venomous. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, Madison. I'll destroy you. You'll get nothing. Not a penny." She paused, looking back over her shoulder. In that moment, with the harsh hospital lights creating a halo effect around her disheveled hair, with her hand protectively cradling her unborn child, she looked like something out of a classical painting, a Madonna betrayed but not broken. "We'll see about that, Benjamin," she said simply, and then walked away, leaving Benjamin and Victoria standing in the corridor like actors who had forgotten their lines, unaware that the curtain had already fallen on their performance. What Benjamin didn't know, couldn't know, was that the teenager's video had already been shared 300 times in the 30 seconds since it was posted. Within an hour, it would have 1 million views. Within 3 hours, number Madison Strong would be trending globally. The slap heard round the world, they would call it. But more importantly, what Benjamin didn't know was that Douglas Hayes, Madison's father, had been preparing for this moment. The prenup Benjamin had been so proud of, the one he thought would leave Madison with nothing, contained a clause that his arrogant lawyers had overlooked, a clause that Douglas, with 40 years of legal experience, had insisted upon. In the event of infidelity combined with any form of abuse, documented in a public setting, all marital assets would transfer immediately to the injured party. The slap had been recorded. The emotional abuse had been witnessed. The infidelity had been admitted. Benjamin Cross had just signed his own financial death warrant, and he didn't even know it yet. Madison's story truly began long before that devastating moment in the hospital corridor. She had been raised in the suburbs of Chicago, the only daughter of Douglas Hayes, a self-made man who had built his construction empire from a single truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days. Unlike the silver spoon elite that Benjamin ran with, the Hayes family knew the value of earned success, of calloused hands, and kept promises. Madison's mother, Eleanor, had been a teacher who instilled in her daughter a love of books and a belief that kindness was not weakness but a form of strength that required tremendous courage. When Eleanor died of cancer when Madison was 15, it had broken something in both Madison and Douglas. They had clung to each other through the grief. Douglas pouring himself into his work while Madison threw herself into her studies, both running from pain in their own ways. After graduating from Northwestern with a degree in childhood education, Madison had become an editor at a small publishing house specializing in children's literature. She loved her work, loved the way a story could shape a young mind, plant seeds of empathy and wonder. Her colleagues described her as brilliant but humble, someone who could spot a bestseller in a rough manuscript, but never took credit for her contributions. She met Benjamin Cross at a charity auction for literacy programs. He had been impossible to ignore, tall, commanding, with the kind of confidence that bent rooms to his will. At 34, he was already a legend in real estate development, turning abandoned industrial sites into luxury complexes that redefined neighborhoods. When he approached her at the bar, Madison had been prepared to brush off another entitled suit. But Benjamin had surprised her. "You're the one who edited The Garden of Infinite Doors, aren't you?" he'd said, referencing a children's book that had become an unexpected bestseller. "How did you know that?" she'd asked, genuinely surprised. "I make it my business to know interesting people," he'd replied with a smile that seemed genuine. "My niece is obsessed with that book. She makes me read it every time I visit. I've probably memorized it by now." They'd talk for 2 hours about literature, about the importance of imagination in childhood development, about his difficult upbringing in Detroit, and how books had been his escape from a father who believed strength meant never showing emotion. He'd seemed vulnerable, real, nothing like the corporate shark his reputation suggested. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of romantic gestures, weekend trips to Paris, first edition books delivered to her office, donations to literacy charities in her name. When he proposed after just 6 months, in the Art Institute of Chicago in front of Monet's water lilies, her favorite painting, Madison had said yes without hesitation. Douglas had been skeptical. "He's ambitious," her father had said over dinner at his modest but comfortable home. "Maybe too ambitious. There's something hungry about him, Madison. Be careful." But Madison, drunk on love and possibility, had dismissed her father's concerns. The wedding had been a grand affair at the Drake Hotel, 500 guests from Benjamin's business world in Madison's more modest circle. Benjamin had actually cried when she walked down the aisle, or at least she'd thought those were tears of joy. The first year had been everything she dreamed. Benjamin was attentive, passionate, seemingly devoted. He'd surprise her with breakfast in bed, leave love notes in her jewelry box, call her in the middle of important meetings just to hear her voice. When she told him she was pregnant, 8 months into their marriage, he'd spun her around their Lincoln Park penthouse, laughing with what seemed like pure joy. "We're building a dynasty," he'd said, his hands splayed across her still flat stomach. "This child will have everything: the best schools, the best opportunities, the best life." She should have heard the warning in those words, the possessive planning, the reduction of their child to another acquisition. But she'd been too happy to notice, too caught up in the fairy tale to see the brothers' grim darkness creeping in at the edges. The change had been gradual at first. Missed dinners became routine. Phone calls grew shorter, more perfunctory. He started criticizing small things: the way she laughed too loudly at parties, how she spent too much time with her little books instead of networking with the wives of his business associates. When she tried to talk to him about it, he dismissed her concerns as hormonal, the typical irrationality of pregnancy. Then Victoria Sterling entered their lives. She was introduced as a potential investor, the daughter of a Swiss banking family with connections throughout Europe. Benjamin had insisted Madison attend the dinner where they first met, at an exclusive restaurant where reservations were currency and appearances were everything. Victoria had been perfectly polite, complimenting Madison's dress, asking about her work with what seemed like genuine interest. But there was something predatory in her gaze when she looked at Benjamin, something triumphant in her smile when he laughed at her jokes. Madison had watched them interact with growing unease, noting how Victoria touched Benjamin's arm when she spoke, how he leaned in closer than necessary to hear her over the restaurant's ambient noise. "She's very beautiful," Madison had said in the car afterward, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Is she?" Benjamin had responded, his tone dismissive. "I hadn't noticed. I was too focused on the numbers. Her family's investment could triple our expansion capabilities." But he had noticed. Of course he had noticed. The late nights at the office became overnight trips, the weekend conferences that spouses weren't invited to. The new cologne, the unexplained charges on credit card statements, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down during dinner. Madison had confronted him once, when she was 5 months pregnant and found a receipt for a bracelet she'd never received, from a jeweler in Geneva where he'd supposedly been attending a development summit. "You're being paranoid," he'd said, his voice cold enough to frost the windows of their bedroom. "This is exactly why I didn't want you getting pregnant so soon. The hormones are making you irrational." "Benjamin, I just want to know." "What you need to know," he'd interrupted, "is your place. I provide for this family. I make the deals, I take the risks, I build the empire. Your job is to look beautiful, host dinners, and produce an heir. Don't complicate things with jealousy and suspicion." That night, Madison had slept in the guest room for the first time, curled around her growing belly, whispering apologies to the child within for bringing them into such a cold world. She'd thought about leaving then, but where would she go? The prenup Benjamin had insisted on just a formality. Darling, to keep the lawyers happy, seemed to make it clear that leaving would mean starting over with nothing. So she'd stayed, retreating into herself, finding solace in her work and in preparing for the baby. She'd transformed one of the penthouse's spare rooms into a nursery, painting the walls herself with a mural of fantastical forests and friendly creatures, the kind of magical world she'd soon be introducing to her child through the books she'd already started collecting. The weeks passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and silent dinners. Benjamin moved into the guest suite, claiming he didn't want to disturb her sleep. Victoria's perfume began appearing on his clothes with such regularity that Madison wondered if the woman was marking her territory. The distance between them grew until they were strangers, sharing a expensive address. And now, here they were, in a hospital corridor, with their marriage dying in public while their child kicked inside her, as if protesting the chaos of the world they were about to enter. The video of what would become known as the hospital slap went viral within 2 hours of being posted. By evening, it had been viewed over 15 million times, shared with hashtags like #MadisonStrong, #BenjaminExposed, and #Justice for Madison. The initial footage was damning enough, a heavily pregnant woman being emotionally abused by her husband and his mistress, fighting back with a single, decisive slap that seemed to embody the frustration of everyone who'd ever been betrayed. But it was what happened next that transformed a viral moment into a movement. Patricia Chen, veteran investigative journalist and mother of the teenage volunteer who'd captured the video, had been investigating Benjamin Cross for months. Within hours of receiving the video from her daughter, she had her team of reporters digging deeper. What they found was a pattern of behavior that made the hospital confrontation look like the tip of a very dark iceberg. Former employees came forward with stories of Benjamin's cruel management style, his habit of firing people days before bonuses were due, his practice of taking credit for others' ideas while destroying those who challenged him. 3 of his ex-girlfriends, emboldened by Madison's public stand, shared their own experiences of emotional manipulation and financial control. He had a spreadsheet. One ex-girlfriend, a former model named Sarah, revealed in an exclusive interview. He literally ranked women by their family's net worth and connections. When I confronted him about it, he said I should be flattered that I'd ranked so highly. The business revelations were equally damaging. Chen's team uncovered evidence of bid rigging, suspicious fires in buildings Benjamin wanted to buy but couldn't afford, and a pattern of using shell companies to hide assets from investors. The SEC, which had been quietly building a case for months, suddenly found their phones ringing with witnesses eager to testify. But the most shocking revelation came from Victoria Sterling herself, or rather, from who Victoria Sterling really was. Her real name was Veronica Miller, and she was a con artist who had been working her way through wealthy men across 3 continents. The Swiss banking family she claimed connection to had never heard of her. The European connections she'd promised Benjamin were as fictional as her accent, which slipped from continental sophistication to New Jersey whenever she was angry. The media frenzy was unprecedented. Every major news outlet wanted a piece of the story. The hashtag #CrossCrumbles became the #1 trending topic globally. Memes of the slap proliferated, with Madison's hand becoming a symbol of resistance against toxic masculinity and corporate greed. Through it all, Madison remained silent. She had returned to her father's house in suburban Chicago, where Douglas had transformed the entire second floor into a sanctuary for his daughter. He'd hired security to keep the media at bay, the best doctors to monitor her pregnancy, and quietly, the best lawyers to ensure Benjamin would pay for every moment of pain he'd caused. The charity gala, where Benjamin thought he would rehabilitate his image, became his public execution. It was the annual Chicago Children's Hospital benefit, an event Benjamin had been a patron of for years, not out of any genuine concern for sick children, but because it was where Chicago's elite gathered to see and be seen. He arrived with Victoria, still calling herself Victoria Sterling, despite her true identity being exposed just hours earlier, both of them dressed as if for a coronation rather than a charity event. The ballroom fell silent at their entrance. 300 of Chicago's most powerful people turning to stare with expressions ranging from disgust to barely concealed glee at witnessing what promised to be a spectacular downfall. Benjamin strode to the bar with Victoria on his arm, seemingly oblivious to the hostile atmosphere. The bartenders served their champagne with hands that shook slightly, whether from nervousness or anger wasn't clear. Benjamin Cross, a voice called out. Margaret Whitfield, Grand Dame of Chicago society and chair of the hospital's board, approached with the bearing of a queen approaching a condemned prisoner. I'm surprised you have the audacity to show your face here. Margaret, Benjamin said, attempting his most charming smile. I wouldn't miss it. The Children's Hospital has always been close to my heart, Has it? Margaret's voice could have frozen Lake Michigan. Strange, considering you're about to bring a child into this world that you've already abandoned. The room, which had been pretending not to listen, gave up all pretense. Every conversation stopped. Even the string quartet seemed to play more quietly. That's a private matter, Benjamin said, his jaw tightening. No, Margaret corrected. What's private is what happens behind closed doors. What's public is what you do in a hospital corridor in front of witnesses. What's public is your complete lack of shame. Standing here with your, she looked at Victoria, with withering disdain, companion, while your pregnant wife suffers alone. Victoria tried to intervene. You don't understand the full story. Oh, I understand perfectly, Miss Miller. Margaret used Victoria's real name deliberately, watching her face pale. You're a parasite who preys on weak men with more money than sense. And Benjamin here was apparently weak enough and senseless enough to fall for it. Patricia Chen materialized from the crowd, her cameraman already rolling. Mr. Cross, care to comment on the SEC investigation into your business practices? Or perhaps on the fact that Miss Sterling here is wanted for fraud in 3 countries? Benjamin's face flushed red. This is harassment. I'll sue every one of you. With what money? A new voice interjected. Douglas Hayes stepped forward, Madison's father looking every inch the self-made man who'd fought for everything he had. You see, Benjamin, while you were strutting around here like a peacock, I was meeting with my lawyers. That prenup you were so proud of, the one you thought protected you, you should have read the fine print. He pulled out a document, holding it up for everyone to see. Section 7, subsection 3A. In the event of documented infidelity, combined with any form of abuse in a public setting, all marital assets transfer immediately to the injured party. The video from the hospital shows the abuse. You admitted the infidelity on camera. Congratulations, Benjamin. You just gave my daughter everything. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Victoria backed away from Benjamin as if he were radioactive, her survival instincts kicking in. This association is no longer profitable, she said coldly, and walked away, her designer heels clicking across the marble floor as she headed for the exit. Benjamin stood alone in the center of the crowd, his empire crumbling in real time. His phone began buzzing incessantly, investors pulling out, partners severing ties, his entire world collapsing via text message. You planned this, he said to Douglas, his voice cracking. No, Douglas replied. You planned this. Every cruel word, every betrayal, every moment you made my daughter feel worthless, you planned this. We just made sure there would be consequences. Security approached at Margaret's subtle signal. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disturbing the other guests. As Benjamin was escorted out, someone started a slow clap. Then another. Soon the entire ballroom was applauding, not for Benjamin's removal, but for justice being served. Madison, back at her father's house, watched the live stream on her laptop, one hand resting on her belly, where the baby kicked energetically. She felt no joy in Benjamin's humiliation, only a deep, bone-weary sadness for the man she thought she'd married, the life she thought they'd build. He's gone, sweetheart, Douglas said, entering her room with a cup of herbal tea. He can't hurt you anymore. I know, Dad, Madison said, accepting the tea gratefully. I wanted him to love me, to love our baby. Was that so much to ask? From the right person? Number from Benjamin? It was asking for something he didn't have to give. Douglas sat beside her, his presence solid and comforting. Your mother always said that people can only give what they have inside them. Benjamin has ambition, greed, hunger for power. But love? That's not in his inventory. How did Mom know you were different? How did she trust you after everything she'd been through? Madison knew her mother had been in an abusive relationship before meeting Douglas, though they'd rarely discussed it. She didn't at first, Douglas admitted. She made me prove myself day by day, action by action. Real love isn't words, Madison. It's showing up. It's consistency. It's choosing the other person's well-being over your own comfort. Benjamin failed every one of those tests. The baby kicked again, strong enough to make Madison gasp. Active tonight, she said, rubbing the spot. Strong baby, Douglas said with a grandfather's pride. Like their mother, I don't feel strong, Dad. I feel broken. Broken things can be rebuilt, Douglas said gently. Sometimes they come back stronger than before. You'll see. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for the divorce proceedings. Despite the judge's attempts to limit attendance, the public interest in the Cross versus Hayes case had reached fever pitch. Madison entered through a side entrance, wearing a simple navy maternity dress, her father and legal team flanking her protectively. She looked fragile but determined, like a blade that had been tempered by fire. Benjamin sat at the defendant's table looking diminished, his usual swagger replaced by barely controlled fury. His legal team had been reduced to a single, overwhelmed attorney after two major firms had dropped him following the fraud investigations. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. She'd fled the country, though Interpol was very interested in her whereabouts. Judge Catherine Morrison, a veteran of family court with a reputation for fairness and intolerance of theatrics, called the court to order. "We're here for proceedings in the matter of Hayes versus Cross," she stated. "This is a court of law, not a reality show. I expect everyone to conduct themselves accordingly." Madison's attorney, James Sheffield, a silver-haired veteran with 40 years of experience, stood to present their case. "Your Honor, we're here because Benjamin Cross violated not just his marriage vows, but the fundamental trust that forms the basis of any union. The evidence will show a pattern of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and ultimately, public humiliation of a pregnant woman whose only crime was loving someone incapable of love." He presented the evidence methodically: the video from the hospital, witness testimonies, financial records showing Benjamin had hidden assets, proof of his affair with Victoria, Veronica. Each piece of evidence was another nail in Benjamin's coffin. When Benjamin took the stand, his attempt at damage control was pitiful. "She was always fragile," he said, trying to paint Madison as unstable, always needing constant attention, constant validation. "I'm a busy man. I couldn't cater to her every emotional need." "So you decided to cater to Victoria Sterling's needs instead?" Sheffield asked dryly. "That was business. Business that required jewelry purchases, hotel rooms, romantic dinners." Benjamin had no good answer. The most dramatic moment came when Sheffield introduced the prenup clause that Benjamin had overlooked. "Mr. Cross, did you read this agreement before signing?" "Of course. My lawyers reviewed every word, including Section 7, subsection 3A. Benjamin's confidence wavered as Sheffield read the clause aloud, the one that transferred all assets to Madison in the event of publicly documented abuse and infidelity. "But that was meant to protect me," Benjamin protested. "From your pregnant wife?" Sheffield's voice dripped with disdain. "Or did you simply assume you'd never be held accountable?" When Judge Morrison rendered her verdict, it was swift and complete. "Mr. Cross, in my 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a clear-cut case of emotional abuse and complete disregard for the well-being of a spouse and unborn child. The marriage is dissolved. Per the terms of the prenuptial agreement, all marital assets transfer to Mrs. Hayes immediately. You are denied any custody rights pending completion of court-mandated therapy and parenting classes, to be reviewed no sooner than 1 year from today." Benjamin shot to his feet. "You can't do this. That's my child." "A child you were prepared to abandon," Judge Morrison replied coldly. "Biology doesn't make you a father, Mr. Cross. Based on your behavior, I wouldn't trust you with a goldfish." The gavel came down with finality. As Madison left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Hundreds of supporters had gathered, many holding signs reading "Madison Strong and Justice Served." Madison paused at the microphones, her father's steady presence behind her, giving her strength. "2 months ago," she began, her voice stronger than anyone expected, "I was told I was worthless, that I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded. For a moment, I believed it." She looked directly at the cameras, knowing Benjamin would be watching. "But I was wrong. No one deserves to be treated as less than human. No one deserves to have their love used against them as a weapon. To anyone watching who sees themselves in my story, know this: you are stronger than you think. You deserve better. And it's never too late to stand up and say no more." The crowd's roar of approval followed her to the waiting car. As they drove away, Madison felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. 3 weeks later, on a foggy November morning, Madison went into labor. Douglas broke every traffic law getting her to the hospital, his hands steady on the wheel despite his racing heart. The delivery was long and difficult, but Madison refused unnecessary interventions. "I want to feel this," she told the nurses. "I want to be present for every moment." William Douglas Hayes entered the world at 4:23 a.m., 7 pounds of perfect potential with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn chin. When Madison held him for the first time, all the pain of the past months seemed to fade into insignificance. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "I'm your mama, and you are so wanted, so precious, so loved." Douglas, holding his grandson for the first time, wept openly. "He's perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect." News of the birth spread quickly. Flowers arrived from strangers who had followed Madison's story, women who saw their own struggles reflected in hers. Madison asked that they be distributed to other new mothers in the hospital who might be alone. Share them with women who need to know someone cares, she said. The Madison Hayes Foundation for Women and Children was established with the assets from the divorce. Its mission was simple but revolutionary: provide comprehensive support for women leaving abusive relationships, including legal aid, housing, job training, and therapy. But what set it apart was its emphasis on rebuilding identity and self-worth. The first woman to seek help was a teacher named Jennifer, who arrived with 2 teenage daughters and nothing else. "I saw your story," she told Madison. "If you could survive and thrive, maybe I could too." Within 6 months, the foundation had helped over 200 women. Jennifer had found a new teaching position and apartment. Her daughters were thriving. She sent Madison a photo of them at her eldest graduation, all smiling genuinely. These victories sustained Madison through the difficult moments of single motherhood. But life had more surprises in store. At a foundation fundraiser when William was 8 months old, Madison met Thomas Mitchell, a pediatric surgeon who volunteered at the foundation's medical clinic. He was kind without being condescending, funny without being cruel, and when William spit up on his shirt, he just laughed and said, "Well, I've had worse things on me today. Occupational hazard." They became friends first, Thomas showing up with coffee when Madison had been up all night with a teething William, offering to babysit during important foundation meetings, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. "I need to go slow," Madison told him when he finally asked her to dinner, a year after they'd met. "I'm a pediatric surgeon," Thomas replied with a gentle smile. "I specialize in patients." 2 years later, they married in Douglas's backyard, a small ceremony with William as the ring bearer, toddling down the aisle with fierce concentration. When Thomas adopted William officially, giving him the father he deserved, there wasn't a dry eye in the courthouse. Benjamin, meanwhile, had been convicted of fraud and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He sent one letter through his lawyer, establishing a trust fund for William with what little money he had left. The accompanying note was brief. "William, I was not a good man or a good father. Your mother is the strongest person I ever met, though I was too blind to see it. This money cannot buy forgiveness. It's simply an acknowledgement of debt I can never fully repay. Be better than I was. Benjamin Cross." Madison put the letter away for William to decide what to do with when he was older. She felt no satisfaction, only pity for a man who had everything and threw it away. 5 years after the hospital slap, Madison stood at a podium addressing a conference of 2,000 people. She was no longer the broken woman in a hospital gown, but someone who had been forged by fire into something stronger. "Gentleness is not weakness," she began, the words that had become the foundation's motto. "For years, I believed that my gentleness, my desire to see the best in people, my capacity to love, I believed these things made me weak, made me a victim. I was wrong." She looked out at the audience, many of them survivors like herself. Gentleness in the face of cruelty is not weakness, it's resistance. Maintaining your capacity to love when someone tries to beat it out of you is not foolishness, it's rebellion. Refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your light is not naivety, it's the ultimate victory. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. As she walked off stage, she found Thomas waiting with William and their daughter Sophie. William, now 5, ran to her immediately. "Mama, you made people cry happy tears." "Did I?" Madison asked, scooping him up. "You did," Thomas confirmed, kissing her forehead. "You gave them hope." As they walked out together, her real family, her chosen life, her hard-won happiness, Madison thought about the woman she'd been that day in the hospital corridor. Broken, scared, alone, but still fighting. That woman had been stronger than she knew. And from her pain had come purpose. From her suffering had come strength. And from her broken heart had come the determination to help others heal. The slap that had echoed through that hospital corridor had become something so much bigger, a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been told they were worthless, weak, or undeserving of love. And Madison Hayes Mitchell, once broken but now whole, stood as living proof that gentleness is not weakness, that love can heal what cruelty breaks, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, speak out, and refuse to be silenced. The hospital slap had been just the beginning. What followed was nothing less than resurrection.